Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how we can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org. In the literature, there's this finding that a very high proportion of people who reach the highest levels of creative achievement have faced a lot of hardships in their youth. Did you have anything particularly in your youth that you felt was a big obstacle you had to overcome that kind of made you who you are today in psychology?
I've probed the botanical literature, asking if there's any evidence that when plants of any kind have trauma or bad things early, that they become better adults. And the answer is almost not.
Except for seedlings. As a gardener, I learned this, that if you grow a plant from seed and you let it grow inside, and then you plant it in the garden, they'll die overnight. They're just like like limp lettuce. What you have to do is, I think that the term is hardening off. You put them outside for an hour and then for 2 hours, and then they grow more cellulose in their stems, and they're more resistant to being broken in half by the first wind. So seedlings definitely have that property.
So courage is also part. We talk about surprisingness in creativity, but courage seems to me to be, looking around the table, an ingredient in creativity, and that may have something to do with early childhood difficulty.
Frank Barrett did this famous study where he brought the most creative people of his generation to Berkeley at a former fraternity house, and he found the common strand amongst the people at that time. So Truman Capote was there, and a lot of these top writers and others, was something he called ego strength, which was this kind of self-confidence and resiliency aspect.
My parents had the world all figured out, and it was a very strong view and sort of cut us off from everybody else. And then when I started to think that they were wrong about some things, that was a real influence on me to, because I realized they weren't wrong about everything. They were pretty smart. They had everything thought through. So I said, well, I want to just go to the opposite and, reject. That's kind of what my sister did. But once I, broke my attachment to this odd worldview that they had, then I didn't have any emotional ties to anyone. So it sort of enabled me to examine each thing without a strong desire, and set me on a course. I want to end up knowing what's right, and I assume that where I start off is often wrong. So that helped. In terms of the insecurity, they also pushed us academically, and I skipped a grade, which is a social handicap for a boy. I grew up being the small, scrawny one. And being in a big public high school, it was not socially cool to be smart and scrawny.
I think it's sort of hard to say. Because there can be things that are you're talking about prototypic challenges, but the way you experience your life is coming from the inside, and things that can look very cushy from one person's point of view can still be kind of disturbing or traumatic because of how you're thinking about it. You can be a fish egg, your eggshell test. I love the eggshell test in a lot of ways, but not necessarily because of having lost a parent and so forth. So sometimes it's sort of hard to it's sort of a hard question to answer. All kinds of weird things can be happening in your head, and during adolescence usually are.
Conversely, I think that if you have a certain blessed obliviousness, you can not realize how hard your life might look to an external observer. I showed my class this feature from 2020 that Nancy Siegel organized, the behavioral geneticist, of identical twins separated at birth. And we know from that research and other behavioral genetics research that a lot of resilience, susceptibility to depression, every personality trait that you can measure has a non-zero heritable component. But one of the engaging interviews is two very jolly guys separated at birth, one of whom grew up in an orphanage. The other had a loving family. As best you could tell from the interviews, their personalities were very similar. And one of them said, well, when the interviewer said, how was your childhood? And one said, my childhood was very good. And his twin said, what are you talking about? You grew up in an orphanage. He said, yeah, but it was a very nice orphanage. And you can tell that he had edited his memories retrospectively, that given his resilient, optimistic personality, from his point of view, as orphanages go, it wasn't a bad orphanage.
I think a relevant point on the issue of security and insecurity is relative to your zones of confidence and competence. So soon after I got to UVA at the age of 30 or so, I started playing guitar with some people, and then we formed a little band called Pavlov's Dogs. People mostly in the psychology department. And none of us could sing, so I ended up being the lead singer. And I can sort of sing but not well. And I can sort of play guitar but not well. And we put on like 2 shows for, just for our friends. And I was really nervous, and I didn't enjoy it, and I was anxious. And what I realized is that I'm so comfortable in front of a class, I'm so comfortable talking about psychology, I'm really confident, but I'm not good at music. And so it was really unsettling and uncomfortable. So we might seem to you really confident and competent because we're talking about things that we've spent our entire lives mastering. As a kid, I would say I was probably below average. For an adolescent boy, I was probably below average in terms of general confidence, especially confidence with girls. So, when you're incompetent, you feel it.
I think there's a profound effect of what group you find yourself in and how voluntary it is to choose a group, and that a lot of hardship comes from involuntarily finding yourself in a group that doesn't value your own strengths. And conversely, one of the reasons that paradoxically effects of heritability sometimes go up in the life over the course of the lifespan, whereas you might expect that you're formed in childhood, that's where the genes should have the strongest effect, but often the effects are stronger later in life, is that as you have more freedom later in life to affiliate with the groups that bring out your strengths and value your strengths, the environment in effect becomes an effect of your genes because you choose your environment, and that can amplify whatever traits you have. I suspect this is true of other people, that the moments of greatest insecurity in my life were in cases where I found myself in groups that didn't mesh with my own strengths. When I first entered grad school, and I think, Marty, you and I have this in common, among my teachers were Duncan Luce and David Green. And I believe they were your... And I majored in cognitive psychology as an undergraduate, went to graduate school at Harvard, which had just denied tenure to all of its cognitive psychologists, and the department was run by the mathematical psychologists, who had a status and moral hierarchy in which mathematical prowess was the only good in life. And moreover, it was not just something for which you were professionally esteemed, but it had, John, is another one of a moral foundation for your list, is moralized mathematical prowess. If you were not, and I was good at math, like most people in this room are, but I wasn't a mathematician, and I took a certain number of courses, but I didn't major in math. And so I was made to feel that I was not only incompetent, but morally compromised, because I couldn't look at a blackboard full of differential equations and immediately understand them all. And I remember thinking, maybe I'm not cut out for this line of work. Maybe I chose the wrong profession. Until Harvard hired Steve Koslin, a cognitive psychologist with a set of talents much like my own. I started to work with him, and then I kind of got into my groove again. But there were some rough moments, and just because of the mismatch of the context and my own strengths.
This is something we probably want to put a footnote on or make sure we return to, the moralization of rigor, the overweighting of the fear of a type 1 error versus a type 2 error, the idea that it would just be such a terrible thing if you said something that wasn't rigorous, and we're willing to give up all sorts of nominated ideas rather than risk ever accepting one that isn't true. And it is very much, it's a sense that the others are squishy, soft. Mm-hmm. That's a bad thing to do. And so that is, I would think, a block to imagination.
And bad morally, not just professionally.
Right.
I mean,
that's right.
The psychology kicks in.
Yeah, that's right.
When I told my mentor, Peter Madison, who none of you would have heard of, who was a professor at Princeton, that I was going to become a psychologist, he looked at me and he said, there are two reasons that people become psychologists. One is not to be wrong, and the other is not to be boring. I hope you choose the latter.
Big thing that we care about at the Imagination Institute is how we can develop imagination in young people. And I think an education environment, how can we apply some of these principles to an education environment? You know, for kids to feel safe, for kids to feel like they can fail, and also imagine their futures, especially kids that grow up in very poverty-stricken areas.
I think imagination dies when you are afraid of standing out, when you are afraid of speaking out, when you are afraid of being wrong. I think that kills imagination stone cold dead. So if you're afraid of failure, then it's impossible to act on your imagination, at least. I think it also changes when people worship what is as being immutable. I think that imagination doesn't work if you are shut to the blink, intuitive gestalt of things coming together in a new way. And it doesn't work when you're in a social environment of criticism, which is not to say not challenge, but if the challenge is too sharp, too early, then it's like puncturing a balloon, in my experience. For me, imagination thrives when I'm playful, when I am drawing on analogous and bits and pieces that seem irrelevant to solve a problem, when I'm focused on or when I'm quiet, actually, and allow it to play, and when I can then share it at a time with people who I know are going to listen kindly, but still with some challenge, and then it flies.
What Therese was saying about making people feel respected, validated, and safe, those are conditions under which you imagine scenarios that that wouldn't have occurred to you otherwise. So it's the creation of the scenarios. And Chandra Sriprada's view of free will, he says that free will is not about choosing. Rather, free will is about the range of scenarios that you can create. They all have a valence, and the willing part of that is you do the one with the highest valence. That's not mysterious. What freedom is the creation of these scenarios, the range of these scenarios, and the more of those we create, the better we are at evaluating them. That feels to me like the realm of imagination. And Therese was talking about the conditions under which we're better at that.
Yeah.
Well, necessity is also the mother of invention, isn't it? So there are times when we are under pressure, when we have to wing it, create a different solution and do it fast.
One kind of imagination that I think is incredibly important is seeing what's not there. I mean, not about a new way of doing things, but if this theory were correct, I should be seeing this, and this that don't happen.
That's a really good point.
I mean, that's what, I mean, in learnability theory, that's what you do in learnability theory. If this theory about how language acquisition happens, we should be seeing all these different things that you then don't see. And it's really hard to see the things that don't exist. But it requires being really careful about what the theory says and what it would predict, and treating the theory in some sense with respect. Right?
I love that you made that point, because that dovetails so nicely with the recent neuroscience work we're finding. So let's call that the logical imagination, or let's come up with a phrase for that. Basically, what it is that the difference between schizophrenics and people who just generate no quantity of ideas, there's a similarity there. But those who have a coherent imagination that actually involves causal structure in their imagination, you show activation of the executive attention network in conjunction with the default mode network, which we call the imagination network. So in the few percentage of the population that comes up with ideas that aren't only original but are also useful, you find that these two brain networks that normally are opposing in most people work very much in conjunction with each other. So what you're describing is this great confluence of a logical imagination, or a focused imagination that kind of can not only just generate all sorts of different possibilities, but actually can in an intelligent fashion as well organize them and think through the actual reality implications of them. And it's rare, but we do find in the brain that there's greater connectivity in the brains of those that come up between these two brain networks, in those who come up with useful. So it's really cool that you brought that up.
Simply, the problem is that whenever there's a complicated problem space, that is, there aren't just 3 or 4 alternatives like in tic-tac-toe, but you're playing checkers or chess or bridge, you obviously can't try out every possibility and see which ones don't work, because there just aren't enough nanoseconds in the universe for you to do that if the problem is moderately complex. But for someone to have some better chance of coming up with a solution, and it could be one of several solutions, doesn't have to be unique, but it will certainly be an infinitesimal fraction of the combinatorial possibilities. If someone can do that, and if it isn't a miracle, if they're not an angel, and they haven't been vouchsafed the truth by a deity, you have to explain how it is that the small set of possibilities that they do try have some a priori probability of being correct. Obviously, you can't zero in on the correct answer through sheer intuition if you're not an angel, but you have to land in the ballpark. And so as the search people in artificial intelligence put it, you've got to prune the tree, the combinatorially explosive tree of possibilities, and lop off an entire branch so you don't have to try every single one of them, and hopefully find a branch on which the solution is likely to exist a priori, even if you don't know what it is until you do some trial and error testing, some Popperian falsification. So I think one way of stating the problem is successful imagination, as opposed to, say, schizophrenic imagination, would consist of some way of entertaining a class of hypotheses, since you can't clairvoyantly know which is going to be correct, but one in which the solution is likely to lie. So what about intuition or imagination? Meshes well enough with reality, at least probabilistically, so there's some non-zero chance that the solution or a solution will be in the class of hypotheses that you do proposals with testing.
I'd like to add to that I think sometimes you do kind of intuit where the truth lies. What I mean is, I can imagine solving problems the way you just said, where there's an infinite range and your skill comes from lopping off certain branches, then you methodically trace out the others. One thing we haven't really talked about here much is the role in imagination of putting in an incredible amount of time thinking about something to the point where you have very quick intuitions about it. And that's the way I feel that I am with morality and moral psychology. So often people will propose, like, we're talking about, European reactions to the refugee crisis, or whatever it is, people propose something, and it'll be some theory about self-interest or something like that. And my instant reaction is, well, no, this is just not where the action is. This is just wrong. And I can see logically, sure, that's within the space of logical possibilities, but it just feels wrong to me. So I think that if you have mulled your problem, if you've mulled your problem for many years, and you're very well read around, very experienced as well with human interactions around it, you actually kind of can zoom in by intuition. What did you say? The act of an angel? Vouchsafed by an angel. Does this argue for the benefits of a broad liberal arts education in which people are exposed to models and metaphors from multiple fields? Because often that's what happens is an old order is broken up because somebody had some different metaphor or different way of understanding it.
One of the games that we play with our clients is to take a packet of Smarties. In Australia, that's packaged in non-transparent cardboard, and I'd put that on the table and go, okay, so. At the moment, if you have a label that you're going to stick on your forehead that said, "This is what I am," right? People might say, "Well, I'm a brickies assistant, or I'm a nurse, or I'm a receptionist." And what we're going to do is we're going to unpack that, and we're going to combine and recombine the whole of who you are, rather than the current label. So let's just play that with a packet of Smarties. So what is this? What can you use this for? A bit like the imagination game, yeah? So what can you use this for? Well, they're children's lollies. Okay, well, what else can you use them for? Well, you can use it for cake decoration. What else can you use it for? Well, you could use it, whatever. So then we end up with Hansel and Gretel trails and to make a mobile out of, or to chock a door open, or whatever. And so it gradually unwinds from the label and how it's marketed to all its bits and pieces. All of its bits and pieces, its component parts, using the dye to paint with, whatever. It just, and people start to play, and they unwrap the preconceived marketing label and get to thinking about this packet of sweets in lots of different ways. We then turn that analogously to self. So let's think about, here you are, and what are you fascinated by? You're fascinated by fishing, a particular kind of fishing, and making flies, and I don't know, whatever. Or you're fascinated by, and you love to read, and you're interested in travel, and whatever. So yes, you've been a brickies labourer. Yes, you lost an eye. Yes, you lost your little finger, so you can't span the brick anymore. Yes, you've got a back injury, so you cannot do that anymore. But who are you? Not what was your label, but who are you, and who can you be, and how can we recombine and combine all the elements of who you are into what you can be, and are there some new things that you could learn that would extend that even further, and let's play with some options. So let's play with some options, let's play with those options, and remember and let's play that together in this small group, 5 to 7 people, so classic social psychology, not too big. Let's play it, and let's play that together about each person around the table, and come up with as many options as possible, because we're not committing to anything, we're just playing. There's no failure here. And so you come up with lots and lots of options. So the guy who was a brickies labourer, who left school when he was 14, his dad got him his job as a brickies labourer, actually was president of his fishing club, and became a bait and tackle consultant, trebling the business of the bait and tackle shop, because he was president of the local fishing shop club. He knew where all the fish were. He knew when to use what, and he just became basically a consultant. He never thought that was going to be who he was.
In some sense, what you're saying is that many people are just limited by not just imagination, but also fear of becoming something different than they were, right?
Well, people like this man was told he was stupid, right? Was told education didn't matter, had a father came from a family where no one went into education. In fact, he had learned, if you think about what he knew about fishing, and about the different fish and the conditions and the bait and the time of day and the tides, he had learned self-directed learning. He had never imagined that that could be a job.
Talked yesterday about how something doesn't feel right, something, and it's not exactly the same, but something doesn't feel right to you, and then you just keep working at it. But another way to say it is, where, like, here's an interesting problem, there's nothing written about it, there's nothing in our field about it. And that's the feeling of having all this low-hanging fruit. And if you're not politically correct, there's all these trees that, God has said, you shall not eat from this tree or this tree or this tree, and we say, screw you, I'm eating from it.
In business, that's exactly what I do. I look for gaps. Mm-hmm. Where's a need that isn't being filled, and is it a real need? And if it's a real need, how can it be filled? And who can pay for it? My brain does that all the time. My brain, so there's a bit of my brain which I'm trying to turn down at the moment so I can have a holiday. It just constantly generates that.
Yeah.
So last week I'm sitting in a pub minding my own business in London, having lunch with a friend. And she said, so, what are your ideas at the moment? She said, and I said, oh, look, the one that's just bugging me right now is you can't get good coffee in a London pub. So why don't I partner with an Australian, a great Australian coffee maker who also makes wonderful machines, who grinds their own coffee, train baristas, and use pubs during their downtimes during the day, and have great coffee. Now this just does this all the time. It's just looking for, there's a gap. Well, we could fill it like this. Well, and then we could do this, and then we could do that, and then we could do this, and then we could do that. And shut up! I'm trying to have lunch with Sophie.
If you're really deeply committed to causality, as I am, and you take certain theories seriously and what they imply, and if you follow the line of implication without shackles on your mind, just where it leads, it often will lead you to places that nobody's doing anything before. So from the point of view of, thinking about evolutionary biology, and you start thinking about, well, what topics would you be studying if you were coming from this perspective? I mean, there's obvious things like kinship and parenting and mating and hunting and cooperation in groups for group hunting and foraging memory and things like this. Open up a Psych 1 textbook, none of them are in there. Not one of them is in there. I mean, now there might be a little bit of mating. I mean, but even when I started teaching Psych 1, there was zero in there. And so there's that leads you in the same low-hanging fruit place. And the second thing is, if you really, really are serious about causality, you care about how theories link up to one another, and if you take theories really seriously for what they actually say, you'll sometimes see where it looks like this one and this one kind of fit together, but the causal links that people they've sort of glossed over that, and then you realize something's very wrong. There's something very missing here about how everything over here connects to everything over here. And I mean, this is one of the things that actually John Antubi, my husband, is amazing at seeing those disconnections, seeing those, it's like for an entrepreneur like Trez, it's like seeing these gaps, but they're gaps in what a theory doesn't explain, that people are just sort of assuming that is explained but isn't really. And that leads you into very strange, different syntheses as well.
I admire about you very much. There are a lot of things that I've picked up on these past couple of days that I just admire about all of you. One is the deep intrinsic motivation you have for kind of getting at the crux of the matter without all the fat around it. The intrinsic motivation for it, as well as the ability to do that as well. So not just the intrinsic motivation, but also the ability to cut through all the extraneous. What I'm hearing is a common theme of this whole thing is it's not just political correctness. There's something above that, and that's all the external factors that are kind of impeding on your independence of thought, your independence of discovery. I think there's a broader theme here emerging from these 2 days. So I admire that. I mean, I'm incredibly inspired by all of you because of these two things that I picked up on. So thanks.
There's a restlessness in everybody about sorting out the what are people not looking at, what's incongruous, what's incompatible, what's the logical end of this. There's a restlessness, which may be obsession, maybe a restless fascination. There's not a kind of a imagining is not. It's not a peaceful acceptance of the status quo, is it?
No.
So academic imagination is certainly not a peaceful acceptance of what everybody knows.
I think this moves us in a direction of another topic that we're very interested in, and that's the cross-domain issue. Is the kind of creativity and imagination we're talking about so far specific to psychology, or is there something across domains? So one of the things on Marie and Scott's list was your imagination in domains other than psychology. So if I can transition to that without embarrassing Steve, I think of Steve as a polymath. That is, I think he's done this imaginative thing in more than one place, and not just like, one might think of Leonard Cohen, for example, where poetry and music, but those are sort of similar domains. Whereas style, Steve's most recent book is Sense of Style, a fantastically humorous book, as well as the best stuff I've read on how to write, which is so different than solving problems, it seemed to me, of mind and human nature and violence. So I'd kind of like to know for each of you, if we could perhaps start with Steve, the question of imagine what's the best, what do you do in domains other than psychology or other than what you work on all the time?
It helps to think of everything as a kind of psychology. And so I think if I can claim what's original about the Sense of Style, it is treating the problem of how to write clearly and stylishly as a problem in psychology. So it may be there's a sense in which it's less creative than it could be described as, if what I'm doing is taking what I think I'm good at and applying it to a domain where it has never been applied before. Because all of the other style manuals and style advice has been written by writers and editors, kind of distilling their conventional wisdom, their intuitions, but what I thought was an obvious application, namely linguistics and cognitive science, to the task of clear writing had never been done before. So maybe I'm answering the question by saying, I'm actually not such a polymath. I have my hammer. One thing that people have said to me that I take that means a lot to me, as opposed to the usual kind of very flattery and nice words, is that when I have written in other domains, often people in those domains will say, "Oh, you think like a philosopher," or early on, Lita said to me, "Oh, you think like a biologist." And when I ventured into political science and international relations, people said, "Oh, that's really odd. You're a psychologist, but you really think like a political scientist." So I think, I don't know if it's just that I think what I do is, in every case where I venture into some other field, I immerse myself in the literature in that field, and I try to understand from the inside what are the kind of questions that they ask, what are the kinds of answers that are acceptable, what are the kinds of evidence that are relevant. And I think that might be a difference between some of the successful cross-disciplinary applications, whereas I often hear, especially from scientists who have a certain amount of hubris when it comes to topics outside their area of expertise, they often come off as incredibly naive and simple-minded. Like if you ask us a lot of scientists about certain world problems, they'll come up with the kind of answers that would occur to a bright adolescent thinking about it for a few seconds, like, oh, the problem for peace, world government. That we need world government. Or the problem of poverty, overpopulation. Just distribute contraceptives. And that's why often I think scientists blunder into needlessly politically incorrect solutions. Like, oh, well, eugenics. Why don't we just reduce crime by having parents of criminals not be able to have kids? Or parental licensure, that's another one. The problem is bad parenting, and so therefore you should apply for a license for the government before you're allowed to have a kid. So these are the kinds of solutions that I have time and again heard scientists propose. Natural scientists, sorry, yes, natural, exactly. And the flaw in each case is not immersing yourself into the literature to anticipate the pitfalls that other people who've thought a lot about it have already worked out. And so you block off a lot of blind alleys that other people have already explored. And so in any literature that I explore, contrary to the natural scientist's instinct, well, all it needs is a bolt of creativity from someone really smart like me. I think that's a bad approach, and you really have to know. You have to avoid the mistake. I mean, I could in another life I could get into music. I would love to learn more music theory. Cool. I mean, I know a smidgen, and I'm interested in work that, for example, looks at parallels between the grammar of music and the grammar of language, such as the work of Ray Jackendoff and Fred Lerdahl, which I think is very deep and profound. So I can imagine other lives in which I would pursue other things in greater depth, but probably literary analysis would not be one of them.
I'm not a great bridge player. I'm a good bridge player. And it's taught me a great deal about the topic that we're talking about, because I've played with and against all the great bridge players in the world. Interestingly, bridge is a sport in which imagination does not pay off. That is, it's typically a game of stamina in which you play for 7 or 8 consecutive days, long hours, and therefore the fewer mistakes you make, the better. And since I pay the great pros to play with me in events like this, they're particularly saying, don't make mistakes, just put your oar in. But it's very interesting when something creative happens at the card table. So this is a bit about polymathhood. So there's only one person in the world of cards who is both a world-class bridge player and a world-class poker player. And they're very different games. You know, I play both of them. Poker I'm really mediocre at. But Steve Weinstein, who's on my list of polymaths, is world-class in both. He did something 2 years ago at the bridge table with thousands of us watching that no one had ever done before. He combined a poker move into the very finals of the Great World Championship. And I think I can describe it even if you're not a bridge player. So in poker, you bluff. In bridge, you don't bluff. Basically, in bridge, it's a partnership game. You describe what you have to your partner, and by both describing together, you end up in the optimal place. You never bluff. And so what Steve did, which had never been done before, he bluffed that he had no clubs in his hand. You have 13 cards, that he was void in clubs. No one had ever done that before, and therefore they then bid the Grand Slam, and therefore the person with the ace of clubs did not lead it. And he made all 13. No one had ever done that before. And there are thousands of us watching on television. It just never happened before. So that was one instance in which Steve combined a poker skill into bridge.
if we could put together, in an ideal world, what are some questions that are unanswered that would be wonderful to pursue? Kind of common themes that have been raised throughout the course of the past couple days.
I'd want to see research or projects that try to speed up the rates of idea generation and evaluation.
Yeah.
So, and it's sort of actually related to the idea of starting businesses. If there's all these drags on starting businesses, and it takes a year, then it's going to be a dead economic zone. But if people can start a business quickly and then it fails, and they start another one and that one works, that's a whole different world. And so that Silicon Valley mantra, fail quickly, obviously it's not just fail quickly, try things and get feedback quickly, and eventually one will work. So if there are ways to do this experimentally, and it would be different in the arts, but or maybe not. But do people have ideas, or could funding be used to support? I don't know.
Because the question is, what's the filter? Because if it's for entrepreneurs in the economy, there's a decentralized filter, which is, do people want the thing you're providing?
That's right.
Do they want that service? And if they want it, they will pay for it. But with us, what is that filter? It's a bunch of annoying reviewers on. It's 2 annoying reviewers on a. I mean, what's the feedback? There needs to be a feedback process where things that are interesting and new get at least not stomped on.
Okay.
Let's forget
so,
rewarded, but
Okay. Wait. Let's go with this. So the review process is so frustrating because we all have to do so many reviews, and it's so much the luck of the draw. We all have a feeling that this is a huge amount of randomness. My friend Brian Nosek again has proposed or likes the model in which journals like PLOS One or others that are more open access, you put your stuff up. That's it. You just put it up, and then whoever comments on it, and people critique it, and you can respond. And over time, so it's more like a market. It's like a true marketplace of ideas. It's more distributed. So funding. So if we identify the essentially evolutionary component that is needed to get systems working well, and the bottleneck to the evolutionary thinking isn't really the generation of ideas, and you can improve that. But academics are pretty good at generating ideas. It's the filtering, it's the selecting. That's where the bottleneck is. That's what's broken, or not broken, but that's what's inefficient.
yes.
And there could be models that could make it much quicker.
Certainly, I don't know if it would be worth taking on in this group, but alternatives to peer review, tenure evaluation, measures of productivity, all not sacrificing the goals of those, which were quality control and freedom, intellectual freedom. But it seems far-fetched to think we hit in the optimal solution in 1957, and that there's no reason ever to change it. And this will be tough to do from within the university, just because everyone has a vested interest in continuing things the way they've always been done. But ideas kind of flowing in from outside could be effective. Even things like departmental structure. Is the only way to run a university to have a department of psychology and a department of biology and a department of sociology? Mike Kazaniga once suggested in an op-ed in Science, which went nowhere, what if we just dissolve all the departments and any project that requires a collaboration, you just form an ad hoc group of the intellectually most appropriate people for thesis committees, for tenure evaluations. What would happen if we just dissolved the departments?
This is exactly the management approach called holacracy, which Zappos.com has grabbed onto and seems to be failing there. But it's I see the
and
point.
it very well might. But are there is there some third alternative? Who's asking the question of how we organize the production and dissemination of knowledge, looking at innovations, since we know universities won't?
I've heard a lot from everyone here today. It's not necessarily like, do we need to explicitly teach imagination, but we need to give people the tools, the opportunities to exercise certain tools of thinking.
Hearing a whole lot of patterns of cognitive behaviours that I think you can teach. I think there's a suite of behaviours which is look for what's not being asked, look for what's not being served, look for incongruities, look for gaps.
A separate question of whether we should elevate the level of creativity of every individual on the assumption that we just don't have enough creative ideas that are proposed, as opposed to how do we change the institutions so that the creative ideas that do come up, wherever they come from, don't fall dead-born.
But it really is the same question. So if you believe that creativity has a originality component and a sense of the audience component, then I think what's being said by Steve is, well, we've got a lot of originality around. That's there. What we don't have is good filtering sense of the audience. Now, that's teachable. I mean, surely I learned that over my lifetime to get better and better at what would fly and what wouldn't fly. So if we take sense of the audience seriously, that strikes me as teachable. And, when people like Robinson say, the schools crush creativity out of little children, I think that's sheer nonsense.
Yeah, I do too.
I think that's what's going on here, is that kids are highly original. They're unmyelinated, they're all over the place, but they're terrible at sense of the audience. And so for me, what you want to teach little kids about is something about sense of the audience. You have to know the discipline, you have to know the gatekeepers, you have to know civility, you have to have a sense of the market. So I kind of think Steve's right that we're pretty good about originality, but what we're not good at, and what's teachable, I think, is the filter.
But is it the filter, or is it an institutional structure that prevents ideas that everyone might agree are creative from being implemented because it's in no one's interest to see them implemented? That everyone, it's a great idea, but I won't get a raise if the efficiency of the company or the university or the economy increases, so why should I allow this? And it might threaten me, make my skill set obsolete. Are they kind of institutions I imagine have been studied a lot in business schools? Like, is Zappos a good model or not? I mean, there must be a big literature on that.
Sure.
One way we've kind of organized the spectrum here is originality plus sense of the audience is creativity, and creativity plus bringing it to scale is innovation. So what Steve's focusing on now is this next step. Once you've got creative ideas, what gets in the way and what facilitates bringing them to scale?
I'd like to suggest a metaphor to reorganize what you just said. So in the happiness hypothesis, I developed the metaphor that the mind is divided like a rider on an elephant. The rider is the conscious reasoning. You can teach the rider, you can give the rider a course in creativity. The elephant is the intuition, is the other 99%. Over many years, we've all developed an intuitive sense of what's right, what's wrong, what's going to work. So if you change the elephant, then you get permanent change, you get learning. If you teach the rider, you tend to get nothing. If you measure it on the last day of class, you'll get the rider reporting back. But if you measure it out of context a month after class, you tend to get nothing. What I left out was what Chip Heath and Dan Heath added to my model in their book Switch, which was the path. You've got the rider on the elephant, and the elephant is on a path. And this is the whole idea of nudge, is if you want to change an organization, small changes to the path make all the elephants go that way. Whereas lots of courses for the rider on ethical behavior, let's say, we're going to give that rider a mandatory training in ethics, and then a year later we expect him to steer the elephant that way, and that doesn't happen. So you get by far the most bang for your buck changing the path. You get more bang, but it takes a lot of work to train the elephant, and you tend to get no return on investment for training the rider. That's what is generally found. I have not yet found any evidence that you can teach ethics in a course and have a measurable difference outside of the course. So if we think of it that way, we're talking about there's riders on elephants in the jungle, and we're saying, why don't we build some paths? Let's build paths because there are good elephants there and there are good riders on them, but they don't really have they don't know which way to go or have a clear way to get there. So I think, again, think about ecosystems and paths, and institutions are those paths. They're paths that generation after generation comes through. And how should we be changing those paths now as things change?
Teaching explicitly imagination and creativity might be a fool's errand, but I really like this idea of changing the path. I really like that maybe we can teach in a way that encourages more originality. It encourages people to feel safer to explore crazy ideas or wild ideas. So there's a way to teach in a methodological way that encourages these things, as opposed to today we're going to have a lesson plan to teach how to be more creative.
If I can be a little bit touchy-feely for a second.
I love that.
Sometimes there are virtues, but sometimes you can say to the writer, like, go of the freaking reins, okay? And sometimes there are certain virtues, and one of them, I think, it's going to sound very sappy, but is that it's okay to love something, that you do things that you love. If you do things that you love, it'll take you into paths that you wouldn't necessarily go to. It's letting your elephant go.
Yeah.
I'm seeing
And it's like, giving somebody permission that it's okay to explore the things you love. Like, I watch this with myself, but I watch it with my daughter, who's an incredibly well-educated person in literature and in history. She knows much more than I do. And it's because she follows these funny paths of interest. She'll follow her interests. And this is not from school. This is on her own. In the oddest directions, but she ends up encompassing large areas because she's following things that she loves. And I think, we don't very often say to our graduate students or our undergraduates, do what you love. Stop talking to me about, what you have to do to get a job and da-da-da-da.
Do what you love.
Do what you love.
Follow your field of
and actually
fascination.
feel it, like not like in a trivial way. Something that's deeply meaningful to you, something that's deeply meaningful to you. And I think that often unleashes your elephant to go in funny paths. Somebody chooses a problem, it's an interesting problem, they worked on it hard, they discovered it was a strong nuclear force, how it works, and then somebody even notices it. That's so cool. It's
That's
also
cool.
cool.
That's
And
really
it's like,
cool.
for me, when something good happens to one of my colleagues, there's no zero-sumness. In fact, it's good for all of us. I mean, we all benefit from it.
A team thing, yeah.
It's a team thing, and a lot of people, they don't think of it that way. They think that something good happening for somebody else is
And so
something
there's
bad
less for
happening
me.
for
That means-
them.
yeah.
And it's very interesting
It's
that
a-
what the kids do is snap you into the zero-sum mindset versus a positive-sum
Yeah.
mindset. Because
Yeah.
we can, as humans, we can be snapped into both of them.
And can you learn that? So can you teach it? So can you teach?
Or can you
the
reframe
difference-
situations so that people see them as
between a
positive sum?
scarcity
that Marty was
mentality
talking about.
and an abundance mentality?
I was wanting to make a comment earlier. We had this discussion of are there hobbies, and this is by way of saying I'm interested in basic research and understanding how imagination works. So I think we have some very fundamental questions we have to understand about it before to figure out how to build it. And when I was in college, one of my professors said, there was new research showing that if you're creative in other ways, it will recharge your creative batteries and make you more creative in your primary work. And this was a humanistic psychology course, but of course back then I believed everything I heard. But I've always tried to live my life that way, except it occurred to me for about 20 years. I stopped. I used to play music and compose and stuff. But thinking about this again, and the question of is imagination trainable, probably there are different parts of the imagination process, some of which may be and may not be. Scott reminded me I contributed to his edited book on creativity and tried to grapple with how do conscious and unconscious work together. There's sort of a mythology that creativity is all in the unconscious, and yet our data showed very much the opposite. And it's probably no accident that human beings, the only really conscious species, are the most creative as well. So ideas may originate from the unconscious, but the conscious has to put them together and fashion them. And also conscious processes become more automatized over time, so that the unconscious gradually takes them over and comes to learn them, which suggests that the unconscious stuff might be trainable, so that if you're doing, say, creative hobbies, that could stimulate the unconscious part of the creative process to be better. But the conscious is a limited resource, and if you're spending an hour a day composing music, maybe that's depleting your capacity to do that, so the short-term effect could be negative. So my thought, my interest would be to try to break down the process by which imagination occurs, understanding the interplay of conscious and unconscious processes, and not expect there to be a simple yes or no answer to the question of is the whole process trainable or not. Some parts may be and some parts may not be.
So there are, I still think that there are elements of cognitive behaviour which must be learnable. that must be learnable, that create that in which are necessary but maybe not sufficient for imagination. So knowing which ones those are and how to teach them will be interesting in terms of research.
Yeah, well, in musical creativity and those things, the unconscious can generate long riffs and stuff, but they're kind of dull. So it takes the conscious mind to sort of appraise it and say, well, that's getting dull, now let's break off and go with another one. And that taste is probably trainable. Now that itself is going to be a mixture of conscious and unconscious. You probably can't evaluate it in a purely conscious fashion. You probably can't evaluate it in a purely unconscious either. You have to appreciate it. You know, even seeing a painting, learning to appreciate a new kind of art or something, you have to experience it. You have to have automatic reactions. But you can learn over time, well, this is really better than that. Again, working with the interplay, and yes, some parts of them are crucially trainable.
I think that's so cool you wrote that in a humanistic psychology because they were so interested in self-consciousness and creative self-consciousness. So that's really cool.